The air was thick with dust, clinging to every surface in the abandoned warehouse as if sealing away memories long forgotten. Broken windows let in faint threads of moonlight, casting fractured, eerie patterns along the cracked walls and rusting machinery. The only sounds were the quiet, almost reluctant hum of a distant generator and the occasional drop of water echoing somewhere in the hollow darkness. It was an environment that would put most people on edge. But Tasha Owens felt an odd sense of comfort here. She moved through the shadows, her footsteps muffled against the concrete floor. Dressed in a simple black hoodie and athletic pants, her form blended into the darkness with practiced ease. Like a specter haunting the empty halls, Tasha had chosen this place deliberately, needing the isolation it provided, the uninterrupted silence in which she could feel each muscle stretch and each thought settle. Here, there was nothing but the echo of her movements and the steady rhythm of her breathing, grounding her in the solitude she had come to cherish. Years ago, solitude had been a luxury she couldn't afford. As an intelligence operative, she'd lived in the constant flow of chaos, missions that demanded everything she had and more, training that hardened her to a razor's edge. Her days had been filled with planning, strategy, and careful manipulation, while her nights were restless, haunted by the faces and places she could never forget. Her world was once a place of calculated dangers and high-stakes decisions, where even the smallest slip could mean life or death. But now, the only thing she had to navigate was the quiet tension inside herself. Tasha paused, standing in the center of the warehouse, breathing in the scent of rust and damp concrete. She had begun these late-night sessions almost as a ritual, a way to stay sharp even as her former life faded into the past. Each movement, each stretch, and every punch thrown into the darkness was a reminder that she still had control, that she was still in command of herself. There was no crowd to impress, no trainer shouting commands, only her instincts, honed from years of demanding work, and the sense of calm that came with each fluid motion. To anyone else, she might appear as just a woman in her 30s trying to stay fit. But Tasha knew her quiet exterior was a front, hiding layers of skill and experience that would be unfathomable to those who hadn't lived her life. She was no longer officially in the field, but old habits died hard. Each stretch and stance was filled with purpose. Each shift of her weight was calculated. Every fiber in her body was tuned to the environment around her. Her quiet vigilance never rested. Like a coiled spring, ever ready, she bent down, touching the cold floor with her fingertips, and inhaled deeply, allowing herself to let go of the lingering weight from the day. But just as she closed her eyes, a faint sensation prickled at the back of her neck, bringing her focus back to the present with sudden intensity. Her years in the field had ingrained an instinct she couldn't ignore, a gut feeling that had saved her more times than she could count. It was the unmistakable awareness of being watched. Tasha straightened slowly, her body still but her senses sharp as a blade. The quiet around her was still heavy, undisturbed, but the feeling lingered, that subtle tension crawling over her skin like an unwelcome visitor. She let the sensation settle in, assessing it rather than dismissing it. For Tasha, ignoring intuition was never an option. It was often the quietest cues, the barely perceptible changes in the air, the smallest shifts in the environment that could be the difference between safety and peril. And right now, her instincts told her something was off. She opened her eyes, scanning her surroundings without moving her head, each darkened corner revealing itself to her watchful gaze. Tasha knew this was no ordinary kind of awareness. This was the primal, survivalist sense that had been honed through years of facing the unknown, always prepared to react, to defend, to endure. Whatever was out there in the shadows, she would be ready for it. In that brief moment, as she stood motionless in the quiet warehouse, Tasha felt something familiar settle over her, the calm assurance that had carried her through countless missions, the same resolve that had seen her through a life most couldn't imagine. And here, in the silence of this forgotten place, she prepared herself for whatever might come next. Outside the abandoned warehouse, Officer Kyle Stevens sat in his patrol car. Eyes narrowed as he observed the quiet building. His hand rested loosely on the steering wheel, fingers tapping an uneven rhythm that betrayed his restlessness. He had patrolled this part of town for years, a routine that he'd grown to accept with a mixture of boredom and resentment. The forgotten corners of the city were left to people who seemed, to him, like they belonged in the shadows. The drifters, the loiterers, the young and restless. It was here he felt his authority held the most sway, where he could command respect without question. Tonight, something had pulled him to this warehouse. It was an unusual impulse. Normally, he would only drive by, maybe shine his flashlight to scare off any stragglers. But something in him had changed as he caught sight of a lone figure moving within. The dim light flickering from broken windows outlined a woman inside. Her movements controlled, purposeful. There was a confidence about her he couldn't place, something that irritated him in a way he couldn't shake. Kyle prided himself on his take-no-nonsense approach to policing. Some called him strict. Others said he was too heavy-handed. He justified his actions to himself as keeping the peace. What others saw as roughness, he saw as necessary toughness. He had grown accustomed to the power his badge granted him, and he often carried it like armor, shielding himself from the doubts and insecurities that lurked just beneath his hardened exterior. Out here, he was the law, the authority, and he liked to remind people of it. The woman in the warehouse didn't fit the usual mold. She wasn't one of the regulars he encountered on his night shifts, those who would avert their eyes, lower their heads, and melt into the background at the sight of him. No, she moved with a strange calm, an assurance he couldn't ignore. Her solitude, her seeming disregard for any potential threat in this forgotten place, grated on him. She was alone, yes, but unafraid, as though she owned the space around her. He felt a prickling irritation as he watched her, his mind racing with possibilities. Perhaps she was hiding something, or maybe she was here for reasons best left unspoken. Whatever it was, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was challenging him, her very presence taunting his authority. Kyle's hand tightened around the wheel, his jaw clenched as he finally made a decision. He was going to investigate this woman, find out who she was and why she was here. Stevens opened the door of his patrol car, the creak of metal slicing through the quiet night. He stepped out, straightening his uniform with practiced precision, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket. It was a small ritual, one that gave him a sense of control, a reminder that he was the one who held power here. The chill of the night air brushed against his face, sharpening his focus as he closed the car door with a thud and began his slow approach toward the warehouse. Each step he took was deliberate, each click of his boots against the pavement resonating with the confidence of someone who expected compliance without question. He walked with a purpose, a shadow looming large under the thin moonlight. As he approached the warehouse, he could see her silhouette more clearly now, a woman standing alone in a sea of shadows, her posture straight, her presence almost unsettling in its stillness. Kyle's eyes narrowed, his annoyance flaring. He had expected to find someone different here, perhaps a loiterer, a troubled teenager, or someone who would scurry away at the sight of his badge. Instead, she stood tall, unmoving, unbothered by his approach, as though she were waiting for him. In his mind, people, especially women, didn't simply stand their ground in his presence. They shrank, lowered their gazes, became small, but not her. There was something in her stance, a quiet defiance that spoke volumes, an implicit challenge he couldn't ignore. His irritation simmered, morphing into a need to assert his authority, to remind her and maybe himself of who held the power here. The thought gnawed at him, a burning need to strip away whatever calmness she exuded, to make her feel the weight of his presence. When he was within earshot, he called out, his voice carrying the practiced tone of an officer who had done this countless times before. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his words laced with an authority sharpened by his lingering hostility. "Mind telling me what you're doing here at this hour?" There was a challenge in his tone, a subtle indication that her presence alone was enough to warrant his suspicion. He wanted her to feel his distrust, to sense his disapproval, as if by being there, she was crossing an invisible line. He could almost hear the excuses she might make, the stammering, the hesitant explanation that would give him the satisfaction of knowing he had unnerved her. But as he waited, she turned slowly to face him, her eyes meeting his with a calm, steady gaze that betrayed nothing. There was no hint of fear, no scrambling apology. She simply looked at him, her face unreadable, her expression exuding a confidence that threw him off balance for a brief moment. She was an enigma, and the lack of nervousness, the absence of guilt, only agitated him further. For a second, he faltered, but he quickly masked it, taking a step closer, allowing his presence to crowd the space between them. He could feel a low burn of frustration building in his chest, fueled by her indifference. People like her weren't supposed to act this way, he thought. They were supposed to react, to show deference, to remember that he was the authority. But she simply stood there, meeting his gaze with a quiet strength that left him feeling exposed in a way he couldn't explain. Stevens clenched his jaw, his fingers itching to assert control, to show her exactly where the line was drawn. He didn't understand it, why she, a woman alone in an abandoned warehouse, could stand before him so unbothered, so sure of herself, the way she seemed to belong. Her calm defiance in the face of his authority felt like an affront, a direct challenge to the power he had worked so hard to command. The thought simmered in his mind, heightening his need to break through that calm, to see her falter, even if only for a moment. And so, as he stood before her, he made a silent promise to himself. Tonight, he would find a way to make her feel his presence, to remind her of his authority. In this forgotten place, he would make sure she remembered who held the power. The cold, dim light from outside barely lit the empty warehouse, casting Officer Stevens and Tasha Owens into stark shadow. The distance between them was narrow, yet filled with a tension that crackled in the silence. Tasha's calm eyes never left his, holding a gaze that most would have quickly averted. She could sense his discomfort, the slight twitch in his jaw, the subtle hardening of his gaze as he looked back at her. In that moment, she knew what he was trying to project: authority, power. But she didn't flinch. If anything, she felt a quiet resolve settle in. Stevens cleared his throat, his posture stiffening as he took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "Ma'am, I asked you a question," he said, his tone carrying the weight of someone who expected compliance. "What are you doing here, at this hour, in an abandoned warehouse?" Tasha watched him, her face calm, unreadable. She considered her words carefully. She had met people like him before, people who found their sense of control in dominance, who wore authority like armor to cover insecurities they could never quite overcome. There was a way they moved, a way they looked at others as if challenging them to step out of line. But she had no interest in cowering or offering him any kind of deference. Her training had instilled in her a discipline that held firm under far worse pressure than a disgruntled officer. "Just training," she replied simply, her voice even, carrying neither explanation nor apology. "I like the quiet here." Her answer didn't seem to satisfy him. Stevens let out a harsh chuckle, the sound echoing through the empty space like a shard of ice. "Training," he repeated, a skeptical edge sharpening his voice. "In an abandoned warehouse, at this hour, alone?" He shook his head, as if the absurdity of her response was reason enough for his suspicion. "Strange place for a workout, don't you think?" Tasha shrugged, keeping her face expressionless. "It's quiet," she replied, the same calm tone. "Not many places around here where you can find that." Her calmness, her complete lack of agitation, seemed to irritate him further. He stepped closer, deliberately closing the gap, hoping to provoke something, anything that would reveal her weakness, her fear. But her gaze remained steady, her posture unchanged, her breathing as even as the moment he'd arrived. To her, he realized, he was nothing more than an inconvenience. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked, his voice growing sharper, a mocking smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He looked her over with obvious skepticism. Pointed, almost contemptuous stare. "A woman, alone, in a place like this? You don't belong here. Things happen in places like these, especially to those who don't know better." Tasha felt a spark of irritation flare within her but kept it tightly controlled, letting none of it show on her face. She understood the game he was playing. His need to pull her into a reaction that would give him leverage. Men like him thrived on fear. They fed off the intimidation that their presence could evoke in others. But Tasha was not just anyone. She was someone who had spent years confronting threats that most people couldn't fathom. This man, with his badge and his thin veneer of control, wasn't someone she feared. "Look, officer," she said, her voice smooth, steady, betraying no hint of tension. "I'm not causing any trouble, just getting some training in, and then I'll be on my way." Her lack of fear was beginning to get under his skin. She could see it in the tightness of his jaw, the way his shoulders tensed as he took another step closer, his eyes narrowing. This wasn't going the way he'd expected, and it was clearly bothering him. Most people would have fumbled by now, offering stammered apologies or nervously explaining themselves in hopes of avoiding a confrontation. But she remained unmoved, a quiet strength radiating from her that only seemed to heighten his frustration. Stevens tilted his head, his gaze intensifying. "You're alone, in an area like this, and you think that's just fine?" he asked, a note of condescension lacing his tone. "Women like you don't usually wander around places like this." He paused, letting the insinuation hang in the air. "I'd suggest you be a little more cooperative. It'd make things easier for both of us." Tasha's eyes never wavered. She felt the anger simmering beneath his calm facade, the frustration that was beginning to bleed through his composed exterior. This was a man who relied on fear, who felt secure in his authority. And right now, she was refusing to give him what he wanted. She had faced down enemies far more dangerous than him, and she wasn't about to let herself be bullied here. Her calm, almost dismissive response seemed to push him to the edge. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "Let me make something clear," he said, his words cold and deliberate, each one carrying the weight of his barely contained hostility. "I could have you arrested for trespassing right now. You're on private property, and you have no business being here. Maybe you should think twice before being so uncooperative." Tasha could feel the surge of adrenaline that came with confrontation, but she kept it tightly reined in, her expression unchanged, her gaze unflinching. She had dealt with men like Stevens before, men who used authority as a shield, who relied on intimidation to cover the insecurities they couldn't admit even to themselves. She knew that reacting now would only fuel his aggression, give him the power he was so desperately trying to assert. "Officer," she replied, her voice calm and firm. "I'm just here to train. Nothing more. I'll be gone soon. And there's no need to make this into something it's not." The firmness in her tone caught him off guard. But only for a moment. Stevens sneered, his face twisting with a flicker of anger that he barely managed to suppress. Her calmness, her refusal to submit, was starting to unravel him. He couldn't understand why she wasn't intimidated, why his threats hadn't worked, and it was only making him more determined to break through her resolve. "Make this into something it's not?" he echoed mockingly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He took another step forward, now close enough that Tasha could smell the stale scent of coffee and cigarettes lingering on his breath. "You think I'm overreacting?" He laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. "You think I'm just wasting time here?" She kept her expression steady, meeting his gaze with a calm intensity that seemed to unnerve him. Inside, Tasha could feel her own frustration growing, but she refused to let it show. This man was a bully, someone who relied on his badge to bolster his sense of worth. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her waver. "Yes, I do," she replied, her voice even, her gaze unwavering. "I think we're both just here doing what we need to do. There's no reason to escalate this." The subtle defiance in her words, the quiet confidence in her tone, seemed to send a fresh wave of irritation coursing through him. He clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching as though he was itching to act, to do something that would wipe that calm expression off her face. For a brief moment, he seemed to hesitate, caught between the urge to lash out and the restraints of his uniform. But his pride, his need to dominate, won out. He took another step forward, now close enough to loom over her, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You don't get to decide that," he said, each word slow, deliberate, dripping with barely concealed menace. "I'm the one in control here, and I'd suggest you remember that before this gets worse." Tasha felt the intensity of his gaze, the barely concealed hostility that simmered beneath his words. She knew he was teetering on the edge, driven by an anger he couldn't quite mask. But she remained unmoved, her eyes meeting his with a calm strength that refused to bend, refused to show fear. "I know exactly where I am," she replied, her voice like steel. "And I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need some space to train." The simplicity of her words, the unyielding calm that laced each syllable, seemed to slice through his aggression like a knife. For a moment, she saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, a brief crack in his composed mask. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a seething anger that he couldn't contain. "You think you're clever," he spat, his voice barely more than a growl. "You think you can just stand here and dismiss me?" He took another step forward, closing the distance between them, his hand flexing as though he were about to reach for his baton. "I'm warning you, lady, you're on thin ice." But Tasha didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her gaze unwavering, her expression calm and composed. She had faced down far worse than this man, and she wasn't about to back down now. "If you're looking for trouble," she said, her voice low and steady, "you won't find it here." The quiet strength in her words, the absolute calm in her gaze, seemed to shatter something in him. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing, his body tense with a rage that he could barely keep in check. And in that moment, she knew she had won this round. The silence in the warehouse grew thick as Officer Stevens and Tasha Owens stood face to face, their gazes locked. Stevens' eyes bore into her, dark and unyielding, while Tasha's calm, unflinching gaze remained steady, mirroring none of the hostility she felt radiating from him. Her restraint only seemed to fuel his frustration. This was not how these encounters usually went. He was used to people bending under his scrutiny, fidgeting with discomfort, offering apologies. But Tasha showed none of that, and her unwavering calm was unraveling him. Bit by bit, Stevens narrowed his eyes, his posture shifting as he crossed his arms, trying to regain a sense of control. "You don't seem to understand the situation you're in," he sneered, each word laced with condescension. "You're trespassing. That alone gives me the right to bring you in. This could end with you in a cell." Tasha tilted her head slightly, watching him with a steady, measured gaze. She let his words hang in the air, unperturbed by his threats. "I've already told you, officer. I'm just here to train." Her tone was even, but there was a quiet strength beneath it, a certainty that made his threats sound hollow. Stevens felt his frustration deepen. She wasn't flinching, wasn't reacting, wasn't giving him the satisfaction of seeing fear cross her face. Her composure was unnerving him, revealing his own insecurity, like a mirror reflecting the desperation he tried so hard to bury. He clenched his jaw, taking a step closer, trying to loom over her, to make her feel small, to impose his authority. "A woman alone in a place like this," he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "It doesn't look right, doesn't feel right. People don't do this unless they're hiding something." "What is it you're hiding?" Tasha didn't move, her expression unchanged. "I'm hiding nothing," she replied, her voice firm. I'm here because I want peace and quiet. That's it. If there's a crime in that, then you'd better tell me. The calm confidence in her words struck him like a blow. He felt a flicker of doubt in his chest, a prickling of uncertainty that he quickly tried to smother. Her indifference to his authority, her refusal to justify herself, made him feel exposed, as if she were seeing straight through him, to the insecurities he kept buried beneath his uniform. The badge on his chest was supposed to make him powerful, respected, feared even. But here, in this darkened warehouse, it felt like nothing more than an empty symbol against the calm defiance of this woman. Look, he said, a sharp edge creeping into his tone. If you want to make this easier on yourself, I suggest you start cooperating. Now. He leaned in, his voice dropping lower, as though he were delivering a final warning. Otherwise, this can go another way, one that you won't like. Tasha felt a surge of adrenaline but forced it back, her expression remaining steady. She'd faced men like Stevens before, people who used authority as a weapon to mask their insecurities. They were all the same. They relied on intimidation, expecting people to crumble beneath their hostility. But Tasha knew how to handle this. She had faced threats far worse than an overzealous cop looking to assert his dominance. I'm not here to fight, officer, she said quietly, her voice low and controlled. But I'm not going to back down just because you want me to. Her words were clear, measured, carrying a weight that went beyond the current moment. Her directness seemed to unnerve him. For a split second, she saw hesitation flicker in his eyes, the briefest hint of doubt that she recognized as a chink in his armor. She wasn't just another face he could intimidate. She was someone who had seen the world in shades of gray, someone who had faced down the worst and come out stronger. And he, despite his uniform, despite the authority he clung to, could sense it. Stevens shifted, his face twisting with frustration. And he took another step closer, now so close that she could feel the heat of his presence. You think you're clever, don't you? He spat, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You think you can just stand here and what? Prove something? His words, though meant to belittle, only revealed his frustration, the growing desperation in his tone. Tasha remained calm, her gaze unwavering, her voice even. No, officer. I'm not here to prove anything. I'm simply here, minding my own business. Her reply landed with the precision of a well-aimed strike. And she saw the effect it had on him, the flash of anger that he barely managed to hide. His hand moved unconsciously toward his belt, fingers brushing against his baton, as though reminding himself of the weapon, of the control it gave him. Tasha noticed the gesture, but her expression remained neutral, revealing nothing of her own alertness, her own readiness to respond if necessary. So you're going to stand there and just ignore my warnings? He asked, his voice growing louder, tinged with disbelief. He wanted to see her break, to make her acknowledge his authority, to make her show the submission he had come to expect in situations like these. But Tasha, in her quiet strength, was showing none of that, and it was driving him to the edge. I'm not ignoring you, she said simply, her voice like steel. I'm just not intimidated by you. The bluntness of her words seemed to slice through his composure, leaving him momentarily speechless. She watched as his face twisted with a mixture of disbelief and rage. The authority he wielded so tightly felt hollow in the face of her quiet defiance, and he didn't know how to respond to it. You think you're untouchable? He sneered, his voice lowering to a growl. You think you can just stand here and what? Challenge me? Tasha held his gaze, her expression unreadable, her voice calm. No, officer, she said quietly. I think you're the one making this into a challenge. Her words hit him like a slap, the sheer audacity of her calm reply cutting through his defenses. He took a step back, his jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. For a moment, he was at a loss, caught in the unyielding calm of her gaze. the quiet strength that refused to bow to his authority. "What's your problem?" he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper, his face inches from hers. He wanted her to react, to flinch, to break the calm that seemed to mock his every move. But she stood there, silent, her gaze steady, her expression unwavering. "I don't have a problem," she replied, her tone as even as before. "I'm just here, like I said." Her words were simple, yet they felt like a challenge, a quiet declaration that she would not be intimidated. And Stevens, in his mounting frustration, felt his grip on control slipping, the authority he clung to unraveling beneath her calm defiance. He couldn't break her, couldn't find the crack in her armor that he so desperately sought. "You're pushing your luck," he said, his voice tight with barely contained anger, each word like a final warning. "One more word, and I'm taking you in. Do you understand?" Tasha's gaze didn't waver. "I understand," she said softly, her tone unchanging. "But I won't give you a reason to take me in." Her calm confidence, her refusal to be cowed, was a revelation, a quiet but undeniable assertion that she was in control of herself, that his threats held no power over her. And in that moment, Stevens felt something cold settle in his chest, a sense of vulnerability, of exposure that he couldn't explain, a realization that he was no longer in control. For a long moment, they stood in silence, two opposing forces locked in a standoff that neither could break. Tasha, calm and resolute, and Stevens, seething with a rage that he couldn't quite contain. And as he looked into her eyes, he saw something that both unnerved and infuriated him, an unbreakable strength, a quiet power that seemed to eclipse his own. In the end, he took a step back, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and frustration, his hands clenching and unclenching as he struggled to regain his composure. Tasha didn't move, her calm gaze never wavering, her presence a reminder of the power she held, not over him, but over herself. And as the silence stretched between them, he realized with a sinking feeling that he might have already lost this battle. The tension between Tasha Owens and Officer Kyle Stevens felt almost tangible, as if the very air around them had thickened, trapping them in this silent standoff. Stevens' face was a mask of barely restrained fury, his jaw tight and his fists clenched as he fought to maintain control. Yet, every second that Tasha stood there calm, unmoved, unafraid, only deepened his frustration. He had come here expecting to intimidate, to assert his authority. Instead, he was the one feeling out of place, stripped of the control he so desperately sought. Stevens took a step forward, his gaze boring into Tasha's with a cold, calculating glare. "You think this is a game?" he spat, his voice low but laced with a simmering anger. "Let me make something very clear. I don't have time for people who don't know their place." Tasha held his gaze, her expression as steady as ever. She wasn't about to back down, and the hint of a smile tugged at the corner of her lips, a calm, quiet defiance that only seemed to agitate him further. Her entire posture was relaxed, her shoulders loose, her hands resting casually at her sides. Nothing about her demeanor suggested fear or submission, and Stevens could feel his patience slipping. "You're awfully calm for someone who's one step away from being arrested," he sneered, trying to provoke a reaction. "You don't seem to understand the position you're in." Tasha tilted her head slightly, studying him with a measured gaze that held neither fear nor anger. "I understand the position perfectly," she replied, her voice steady and unperturbed. "I just don't think intimidation is going to work on me." The quiet confidence in her words struck him like a slap. For a moment, his carefully constructed mask of authority cracked, and she could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She had faced down men like him before, people who used power as a shield, hiding their insecurities behind a badge or a title. She knew his type well, and she knew precisely how to handle this situation. Stevens let out a bitter laugh, his expression hardening as he took another step forward, invading her personal space. People like you don't get to tell me how things are, he said, his tone dripping with contempt. You're on private property, alone, in the middle of the night. You're practically begging for trouble. Tasha didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, her posture relaxed, as if she were unaffected by his looming presence. Look, officer, she replied evenly, her voice calm but firm. I'm here to train, nothing more. I'm not causing any harm, and I'm not interested in whatever power game you're trying to play. Her words were direct, dismissing his authority as easily as if she were brushing off a minor inconvenience. It was as though his threats, his entire presence, meant nothing to her, and the realization sent a surge of anger through him. He clenched his jaw, his hand moving instinctively to rest on his baton, fingers curling around the cold metal as he fought to contain his frustration. You're pushing your luck, he warned, his voice a low, menacing growl. People get hurt in places like this. You don't want to find yourself on the wrong side of the law. Tasha's expression didn't change. If anything, her gaze softened, a hint of pity flashing in her eyes as she looked at him, unflinching. If you think your threats are going to scare me, you're mistaken, she said quietly, her voice carrying a calm strength that seemed to cut through his bluster. I've faced far worse than this. Her words hung in the air, a subtle challenge, a reminder that she was not someone easily intimidated. She had spent years in the field, confronting dangers that would make most people break. And this moment, this attempted show of authority, was nothing in comparison. She had faced down threats with far more at stake. And Stevens, with his overbearing posture and hollow threats, was little more than a nuisance. The realization seemed to hit him hard, and she watched as his face twisted with anger. His hand tightened on his baton, and for a moment, she thought he might actually try to use it. The tension between them had reached a boiling point, his pride and ego stung by her defiance, her quiet dismissal of his power. But she knew he wouldn't dare. She could see it in the flicker of hesitation in his eyes, the uncertainty that betrayed his bravado. Why are you here? He demanded, his voice barely more than a whisper, as though he were grappling with something deeper than his anger. Why do you feel the need to be here, alone, in the middle of the night? Tasha's gaze softened, her expression shifting as she looked at him with something almost akin to understanding. I'm here because it's quiet, she said simply. Because sometimes, the only way to find peace is to be alone with yourself. Her answer seemed to disarm him, if only for a moment. She saw the faintest flicker of doubt in his eyes, the crack in his armor that hinted at something vulnerable beneath the surface. But just as quickly, he smothered it, his expression hardening as he clenched his jaw. I don't buy it, he said, his tone harsh, defensive. People don't come to places like this for peace. They come here to hide, to do things they wouldn't want anyone else to see. She shook her head slightly, a hint of sadness in her gaze. Maybe that's what you expect, she replied quietly. But not everyone fits into your expectations. The simple truth of her words cut through the tension, a reminder that he was projecting his own insecurities, his own suspicions, onto her. She could see it clearly now, the way he clung to his authority, the way he used his badge to validate his sense of worth. It was a fragile power, one that required others to fear him, to submit to him, to uphold the image he needed to feel in control. But Tasha wasn't going to play along. She stood her ground, her calm strength a quiet but undeniable challenge to his authority, to the control he so desperately sought. Stevens felt a surge of anger, his pride wounded by her calm defiance. He had come here expecting submission, obedience, and instead he was faced with a woman who saw through him, who challenged him without a single raised voice or harsh word. It infuriated him, made him feel small in a way he couldn't explain. You're on thin ice, he warned, his voice barely more than a whisper, the threat hollow even to his own ears. One wrong move, and you'll regret it. Tasha's gaze didn't waver. I don't think so, officer, she replied, her voice a calm, unwavering declaration. I know who I am. I know where I stand. And I won't be intimidated by someone who feels the need to prove himself. Her words struck him like a blow, the quiet certainty in her tone exposing the emptiness of his threats. She had seen through him, seen the insecurity behind his authority, the need for dominance that he used as a shield. And as he looked into her eyes, he felt a cold, sinking feeling settle in his chest, a realization that he was no longer in control. In that moment, the silence between them grew heavy, the tension so thick it felt as though the very air had frozen. She stood there, unyielding, her presence a reminder that true power didn't come from a badge or a baton, but from an unbreakable sense of self, a strength that needed no validation. Finally, unable to bear her gaze any longer, Stevens took a step back, his expression twisting with frustration. He had come here to intimidate, to assert his authority, but he had found himself outmatched, his control slipping through his fingers. You think you're untouchable, he spat, his voice a mix of anger and humiliation. You think you can just walk away from this? Tasha looked at him, her gaze steady, her voice soft but firm. No, she said. I just think that I'm not afraid of you. Her words hung in the air, a quiet, undeniable truth that left him speechless. For a long moment, they stood in silence, two opposing forces locked in a battle of wills. But as the tension finally broke, as he turned away in frustration, Tasha felt a quiet sense of victory settle over her. She had stood her ground, unbroken, unafraid, and in that moment, she knew she had won this battle, not through force or intimidation, but through an unshakable resolve, a calm that could not be touched. And as she watched him walk away, she knew that no matter what came next, she would be ready to face it. The tension in the warehouse had reached a fever pitch, thick and stifling, with Officer Stevens standing mere inches from Tasha Owens, his body radiating frustration, his fists clenched. Her unyielding calm was like a mirror reflecting his own insecurities back at him, and he felt as though he were unraveling under the weight of it. His attempts at intimidation, the low, sharp threats, the looming stance, it had all fallen flat. Each word, each move he made, was met with that same unwavering gaze, that quiet confidence that mocked his authority without her saying a single word. Stevens felt his patience snap, a raw edge creeping into his voice. You think you're better than me, don't you? He spat, his voice sharp, cutting. His hand hovered near his baton, fingers twitching as though drawn to the cold metal, to the reassurance of control it offered. He had never felt so out of place in his own uniform, his authority rendered useless, deflated by the calm, unflinching presence before him. Tasha didn't flinch. She saw his hand gravitating toward his baton, saw the slight tremor in his fingers as he grappled with the reality that his power over her was slipping away. Her gaze remained steady, her voice cool. I don't think I'm better than you, officer, but I do know who I am, and I don't need to prove anything to anyone. The calm certainty of her words cut through his facade, leaving him momentarily speechless, his face flushed, anger twisting his features as he tried to regain control of the situation. He took a deep breath, but it didn't help. The air was thick, heavy with tension, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't break through the quiet strength she projected. It made him feel small, diminished. He sneered, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh. You're just another trespasser, he said, his voice trembling with barely concealed fury. Nothing special, just someone who thinks they can get away with whatever they want. He let the words hang in the air, hoping they'd chip away at her confidence. But her expression didn't change. The silence that followed was like a slap in the face, exposing the emptiness of his threats. Officer, Tasha replied, her voice even. If I'm truly doing something wrong, you're welcome to arrest me. But we both know this isn't about me breaking the law. Her statement hit him hard. He felt the heat rising in his cheeks, the truth of her words piercing through the hollow shell of his authority. He realized, with a sinking feeling that she wasn't afraid of him, that she saw through the bluster and intimidation tactics he relied on to command respect. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was the officer, the one with the power. But in this moment, she held all the cards. Desperation clawed at him, and he took a step closer, his hand finally gripping his baton, the metal cool against his palm. "You think you're untouchable?" he hissed, his voice barely more than a whisper, carrying a dangerous edge. "You think I won't act?" Tasha's gaze flicked briefly to the baton, but she remained unfazed, her expression calm, controlled. "If that's what you feel you need to do, then go ahead," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "But ask yourself, what's this really about?" The question struck a nerve, a deeply buried insecurity that he'd long ignored. Her words were like a spotlight, illuminating the cracks in his carefully constructed authority. The baton in his hand felt heavy, its weight a reminder of the lengths he was willing to go to feel in control. But she had stripped that control away, left him exposed in a way that no one had dared to before. Stevens gritted his teeth, his knuckles whitening as he tightened his grip. His pride wouldn't let him back down. Not now. Not in the face of her calm defiance. He raised the baton slightly, a subtle threat, watching for any flicker of fear in her eyes. But there was nothing, just that same steady gaze, watching him, reading him, making him feel small in his own skin. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice trembling with anger. "You don't get to stand here and question me. I'm the law. You're just—" He trailed off, his words hanging in the air, unfinished, hollow. He didn't even know how to finish the sentence because she had shattered the illusion of superiority he clung to. Tasha held his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I know exactly who I am," she replied, her voice soft but filled with a quiet strength. "And I don't need to make anyone else feel small to prove it." Her words landed like a blow, and he felt the control slipping completely from his grasp. In a last-ditch effort to reassert his authority, he swung the baton, aiming for her shoulder, a move meant to intimidate, to remind her of the power he held. But Tasha was faster. She sidestepped smoothly, her movements fluid, effortless, as if she had anticipated his move long before he'd even thought to act. He stumbled, thrown off balance by his own force, and she watched him with that same steady gaze, a calmness that only deepened his humiliation. For a moment, he felt like a child throwing a tantrum, lashing out because he didn't know how else to handle his own frustration. "Is that all you've got?" she asked, her tone neither mocking nor pitying, just calm, unmoved. The question hung in the air, challenging him, exposing the emptiness of his aggression. Stephen's face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. His hand clenched around the baton, but it felt like a toy in his grip, powerless against the quiet strength of the woman before him. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't even moved to defend herself, and yet he felt defeated, as though she had stripped him of every ounce of authority he thought he possessed. He took a step back, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath, to regain control of the situation. But the damage was done. She had seen him for what he truly was, an officer clinging to his badge, his authority, his uniform as a shield against the insecurities he couldn't bear to confront. She had peeled away the layers, leaving him exposed, vulnerable. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, and he felt his pride crumbling beneath the weight of it. For a moment, he considered walking away, ending the confrontation before it spiraled any further out of control. But his pride wouldn't let him. He couldn't admit defeat. Not here. Not to her. "You think you've won," he spat, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But don't think this is over." Tasha watched him, her gaze unwavering, her expression calm. "This was never about winning, officer," she replied softly. "It was about standing my ground." Her words settled over him like a cold truth, a reminder that his authority had been built on a foundation of fear and intimidation. a foundation that crumbled under the weight of her calm defiance. She wasn't fighting him. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply standing her ground, refusing to be intimidated, refusing to give him the power he so desperately sought. Stevens clenched his jaw, his hands trembling as he fought to suppress the storm of emotions raging inside him. He felt defeated, humiliated, stripped of the authority he had once wielded so easily. And as he looked into her eyes, he saw something that unnerved him more than anything else: pity. The pity in her gaze was a reflection of his own failures, his own insecurities, and it cut deeper than any insult, any act of defiance. She saw him for what he truly was, and in that moment, he felt more exposed than he ever had before. He wanted to lash out, to reclaim the control he'd lost, but he knew it was too late. She had already won, not by force, not by intimidation, but by simply refusing to bend to his will. With a low growl of frustration, he turned on his heel, his footsteps echoing through the empty warehouse as he stormed away, his pride in tatters, his authority stripped away. And as he left, he knew that he would never forget this encounter, that the calm strength of the woman he had tried to intimidate would haunt him for a long time to come. Tasha watched him go, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged. She had stood her ground, unbroken, unafraid, and in that moment, she knew she had won, not through force or fear, but through an unshakable resolve that no one could take from her. And as the silence of the warehouse settled around her once more, she felt a quiet sense of victory, a strength that would carry her forward, unyielding and unbreakable. The echo of Officer Stevens' footsteps faded as he reached the far end of the warehouse. Stopping abruptly, as if reconsidering his retreat, he turned slowly, his face shadowed in the dim light filtering through the broken windows. A storm brewed in his eyes, resentment, bruised pride, and something deeper, something he couldn't hide anymore. His anger was a raw, untamed force, like a cornered animal baring its teeth, and he was unwilling to let go of what little control he had left. Tasha stood a few paces away, watching him with the same calm resolve that had become a challenge he couldn't ignore. She could see the tension in his stance, the way his hands flexed at his sides, fists curling and uncurling, as if he were fighting an inner battle. This wasn't over for him. She realized he wasn't going to let it go. The authority he'd clung to so tightly was slipping from his grasp, and he would do anything to reclaim it, even if that meant crossing a line he might later regret. Stevens took a step toward her, his expression hardening as he closed the distance between them. He was no longer merely an officer with a badge. In this moment, he was a man driven by the need to assert his power, a desperate need to see her bend, to break the unbreakable calm that had stripped him of his sense of superiority. "You think you can just stand there and dismiss me?" he said, his voice low, dangerous, each word carrying an unspoken threat. Tasha's eyes didn't waver. She knew men like Stevens, men who hid behind authority to mask their insecurities. But here, in this quiet warehouse, she sensed something different in him, a need to dominate, to prove his worth not just to her, but to himself. She could feel the tension thickening, a simmering rage that he could no longer contain, and she knew that in this moment, her only option was to stand firm, to let him see that she wouldn't break, wouldn't yield. Stevens reached for his baton, the metal glinting faintly in the shadows, and gripped it tightly, lifting it just enough to let her know he was willing to use it. "This could end right now," he said, his voice a harsh whisper, barely restrained. "Or we could make things a little messier." Tasha remained still, her gaze fixed on his, calm and steady, even as his threat hung in the air like a drawn blade. She took a slow, measured breath, her body relaxed yet ready, her instincts sharpened from years of training. She knew that any sudden movement, any reaction of fear or defensiveness, would only embolden him, would give him the satisfaction he so desperately craved. But she wasn't here to satisfy his ego. "Do what you need to do, officer," she replied, her voice even, unshaken. But understand this, you're the one who has something to lose. Not me. Her words landed like a challenge, piercing through his anger, and she saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, a hesitation that barely lasted a second before his pride took over. He raised the baton, taking a step forward, his movements unsteady but full of determination, driven by the need to prove his strength, his control. Without a moment's hesitation, he swung the baton, aiming for her shoulder in a move designed not to injure but to intimidate, to force her into submission. But Tasha was prepared. Her body moved on instinct, fluid and controlled, and she sidestepped his swing with practiced ease, her movements graceful as she pivoted, letting his momentum carry him off balance. His baton cut through empty air, his balance thrown, and he stumbled forward, catching himself just before he could fall. The frustration etched into his features was palpable, a mix of anger and humiliation that he could barely contain. For a moment, they stood still, facing each other in the dim light, the silence between them charged with tension. Tasha watched him closely, her stance relaxed but poised, every muscle attuned to the threat before her. She didn't move to attack, didn't react with aggression. She simply held her ground, her presence a reminder of the strength she held, not through force, but through an unbreakable will. "Is that all you've got?" she asked softly, her tone devoid of mockery or scorn, simply matter-of-fact. Her words seemed to cut through his anger, exposing the futility of his threats, the emptiness of his aggression. Stephen's face flushed with anger, his knuckles white as he tightened his grip on the baton, lifting it again, his posture rigid, coiled with frustration. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the need to reclaim the authority he felt slipping through his fingers. Without another word, he lunged forward, swinging the baton in a wide, forceful arc, aiming for her side this time, determined to land a blow, to see her flinch. But Tasha was ready. She shifted her weight, her movements fluid, and sidestepped once more, her body moving with a practiced ease that only seemed to deepen his frustration. His baton hit nothing but air again, and he stumbled forward, thrown off balance by the force of his own swing. This time, he didn't catch himself, and he fell to one knee, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as he struggled to regain his footing. As he scrambled to his feet, Tasha stood before him, calm and unruffled, watching him with a steady gaze that held neither pity nor fear, only quiet strength. She had seen men like him break under pressure, had watched as their aggression crumbled in the face of unyielding calm, and she knew that Stevens was nearing that breaking point, his pride and ego bruised beyond repair. "You're not very good at this, are you?" she said quietly, her voice soft, almost gentle, as though she were speaking to a child in need of guidance. Her words were devoid of malice, and yet they hit him harder than any physical blow could have. Stephen's face flushed with rage, and he tightened his grip on the baton, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. He looked up at her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and humiliation, and for a moment, he seemed lost, unsure of what to do, of how to respond to her calm defiance. He had expected submission, fear, but she had given him none of that. Instead, she had shown him his own weakness, his own insecurity, reflected back at him through her unbreakable resolve. "I don't need your pity," he spat, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. He struggled to his feet, his posture rigid, defensive, his pride refusing to let him back down. "You think you're so strong, standing there, acting like you're untouchable. But you're not. No one is." Tasha tilted her head, watching him with an expression that was unreadable, her gaze steady, unyielding. "This isn't about strength, officer," she replied softly. "It's about knowing who I am, about refusing to be intimidated. I'm not here to challenge you. I'm here because I have a right to be." Her words, so simple yet so powerful, seemed to cut through his bravado. exposing the emptiness of his aggression. She wasn't fighting him. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply standing her ground, unyielding in her resolve. And he realized, with a sinking feeling, that there was nothing he could do to break that. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, and Stevens felt his control slipping further, felt his authority crumbling beneath the weight of her calm strength. He clenched his fists, his fingers tightening around the baton as he fought to contain the rage boiling inside him. He wanted to lash out, to make her feel the power he so desperately needed to reclaim. But he knew, deep down, that any further action would only deepen his humiliation. Finally, unable to bear her gaze any longer, Stevens let out a frustrated growl and took a step back, his posture rigid, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and defeat. He dropped his baton to the ground with a hollow clatter, the sound echoing through the warehouse like a final surrender. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a simmering resentment, and for a moment, he seemed on the verge of saying something, but the words never came. In the end, he turned on his heel, his footsteps heavy, echoing through the empty warehouse as he walked away, his pride in tatters, his authority shattered. And as he left, he knew, deep down, that he would never forget this encounter, that her quiet strength, her unbreakable calm, would haunt him for a long time to come. Tasha watched him go, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged. She had stood her ground, unbroken, unafraid, and in that moment, she knew she had won, not through force or intimidation, but through an unshakable resolve that no one could take from her. And as the silence of the warehouse settled around her once more, she felt a quiet sense of victory, a strength that would carry her forward, unyielding and unbreakable. Turning her back to the now empty doorway, Tasha felt the weight of her own resilience settle within her, a quiet reassurance that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would be ready to face them, unyielding in her strength, unbreakable in her resolve. The quiet settled over the warehouse like a thick blanket, broken only by the faint hum of the distant generator and the occasional drip of water echoing from somewhere unseen. Tasha Owens stood alone in the dim light, the cool night air brushing against her skin as she let out a long, slow breath. Her heart was still beating a little faster than usual, her body still attuned to the adrenaline that had surged through her. But a sense of calm had begun to replace it, filling the space with a quiet strength. She could feel the weight of the recent confrontation still hanging in the air, lingering like smoke that wouldn't quite clear. Stevens' threats, his frustration, the way his desperation had chipped away at his composure, all of it had left a mark, but not in the way he'd intended. Instead of fear, she felt an unexpected sense of clarity, a reminder of who she was and the strength she had earned through years of facing down intimidation, both on and off the field. But something else lingered too, a strange pity for the man she had just faced, a man trapped in his own need for control. Tasha turned slowly, letting her gaze sweep over the empty space, taking in the quiet solitude of the warehouse. It had been a place of sanctuary for her, a place where she could be alone with her thoughts, her strength, her own sense of self. Yet tonight, it had transformed into something more, a battlefield of wills, a mirror held up to Stephen's own insecurities. And in the process, she had seen his anger, his desperation, stripped bare and exposed under the weight of her resolve. For the first time, she let herself process the emotions that had simmered beneath her calm exterior during the confrontation. She felt a mixture of triumph and exhaustion, a sense of victory but also a sadness she hadn't expected. Stevens had been so driven by his need to prove himself, to assert his authority, that he had lost sight of his humanity. She wondered how many others had faced that same desperation from him, how many people had cowered under his badge, mistaking his bluster for real strength. A faint sigh escaped her lips as she allowed herself to reflect on her own journey, the years she had spent building her inner strength, the sacrifices, the battles fought both outwardly and within. She had faced men like Stevens before, Men who tried to dominate, to control, to bend others to their will. And she had learned, often the hard way, that real strength wasn't about who could shout the loudest or wield the most power. Real strength was quiet, unyielding, rooted in an unshakable sense of self. Tasha's mind drifted back to the early years of her training, the lessons that had shaped her, the mentors who had taught her that courage and resilience were forged in the moments when you stood alone, when you faced down fear without flinching. Those lessons had been hard-won, and they had left scars, both physical and emotional, that had ultimately become symbols of her endurance. She was no longer the young woman who had once questioned her place, her purpose. She knew who she was, and she was done letting anyone make her feel small. But there was something else about tonight that had struck her. Something that had stirred a desire to help others find that same strength within themselves. Her calm defiance had exposed Stephen's insecurities, his vulnerabilities, and she realized that there were likely countless others who had been on the receiving end of his power trips, who had not had the training or the resolve to stand firm. The thought saddened her, but it also awakened something, a purpose, a quiet determination to make sure that others wouldn't feel as helpless as Stevens had wanted her to feel. She thought of the community she had become a part of since stepping away from her former life. She thought of the young people, the women, the men, the neighbors who might one day face the same kind of aggression, the same threats wrapped in a badge of authority. She had a responsibility, she realized, not just to herself but to those who looked up to her, who might one day need a reminder of their own strength. A calm resolve settled over her, solidifying with each thought. She would make herself a resource, an example. She would find ways to reach out to others, to teach them the skills and the mindset that had helped her navigate encounters like tonight's. She would teach them to stand tall, to hold their ground, to know their worth, so that they too could face whatever challenges life threw their way with the same unbreakable strength. As the idea took root, she felt a warmth replace the tension that had once occupied her chest. She glanced down, her eyes falling on the discarded baton Stevens had left behind, a symbol of his failed attempts at dominance, his struggle to wield a power that had slipped through his fingers. She knelt down, picking it up and feeling its weight in her hand. It was cold, impersonal, a tool meant to intimidate, but in her grasp, felt almost meaningless. A reminder that real power didn't lie in a weapon or a uniform but in the quiet, unwavering confidence that she carried within herself. For a moment, she considered taking it with her, a small token to remember this night, a symbol of her victory, but she decided against it. She didn't need a reminder of her strength. It was something that lived within her, something no one could take away. Instead, she set the baton down gently on the ground, leaving it behind as she straightened, a silent testament to the power she had reclaimed not through force but through unbreakable resolve. Turning toward the exit, Tasha took one last look around the warehouse, feeling the weight of her decision settle within her. She would make this night a turning point, a catalyst for change, not just in her own life but in the lives of those she would go on to help. She would carry this strength forward, use it as a foundation for something greater, something that could outlast any single encounter. As she stepped outside, the cool night air filled her lungs, crisp and refreshing, washing away the remnants of tension. The world was still, quiet, and as she looked up at the stars, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Tonight, she had faced down a man who had tried to break her, who had underestimated her strength, and she had emerged unbroken, stronger than ever. The warehouse, now behind her, felt like a memory, a place that had tested her, that had reminded her of her resilience. And as she walked away, she knew that she would carry this strength with her, not as a badge of honor but as a quiet, unshakable force, something that could never be stripped away. Tasha's mind was already racing with plans, ideas of how she could turn this experience into a way to uplift others, to remind them of their worth, their own resilience. She would hold classes, speak at community events, offer mentorship to those who needed it most. She would share her story, her experiences, and help others find the strength within themselves to face whatever life threw at them. As she made her way back home, she felt a sense of purpose settle over her. Solid and sure, the night might have ended, but a new chapter was just beginning. One where she would take the strength she had discovered within herself and use it to empower others, to create a ripple of resilience that would reach far beyond the walls of that old warehouse. She was ready, for herself, for others, for whatever lay ahead. The following days passed quietly, almost in stark contrast to the tense encounter that had unfolded in the warehouse. Tasha Owens moved through her routines, the events of that night drifting back to her in fragments. Every so often, she'd recall Officer Stevens' face twisted with anger, the tension in his voice, the way his authority had crumbled in the face of her calm resolve. She remembered the feeling of standing in that warehouse, unyielding, meeting his threats without fear. It had been a victory, but one she had only begun to understand in the days that followed. The confrontation had stirred something in her, a spark of purpose that grew with each passing day. As she walked through her neighborhood, greeted familiar faces, and passed by the local shops and homes, she began to see the people around her differently. She saw potential, strength, and resilience in them, qualities that reminded her of herself. And with this new perspective came a desire to share what she had learned, to help others find the same unshakable strength that had carried her through that night and so many other challenges. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table with a notebook and pen, she found herself sketching out ideas, making notes, jotting down thoughts on how she could start a program to teach self-defense and resilience in her community. She wanted to empower others, to give them the tools to stand up for themselves, to know their worth, and to meet intimidation or oppression with quiet, unbreakable confidence. Her vision grew as she thought of the young women she often saw walking home from school, the elderly neighbors who felt vulnerable, and the people who had, like her, faced authority figures who misused their power. She would offer them something simple yet transformative, a way to stand tall, a way to protect themselves, both physically and emotionally. Over the next few weeks, Tasha took the first steps to make her idea a reality. She reached out to the local community center, pitching her vision to the director, who was immediately receptive. The center had long been a gathering place for the neighborhood, offering after-school programs, evening classes, and resources for families. Now, it would also be the site of Tasha's program, a space where people could learn to feel empowered, to find strength within themselves. The program took shape, and she began designing courses that combined self-defense techniques with mental resilience training. She wanted her students to understand that true strength came from within, that it was rooted not in brute force but in an unwavering belief in oneself. She drew on her own experiences, her years of training, the lessons she had learned in the field, and the many confrontations she had faced. She crafted lessons that would teach not only physical skills but also the mindset needed to stand firm in the face of fear, intimidation, or doubt. The first day of class arrived, and Tasha felt a mixture of excitement and nerves as she prepared to meet her students. The community center's room had been transformed into a small training space, with mats on the floor and a circle of chairs where the participants could gather. People trickled in, some young, others older, a mix of men and women, all looking a bit unsure of what to expect. As they settled in, Tasha introduced herself, sharing a bit about her background, though she kept the details of her past career vague. She told them about her passion for resilience, for helping others find strength within themselves. She spoke about the importance of self-worth, of standing tall, and of knowing that, no matter who they faced, they could hold their ground. Her students listened intently, nodding as she spoke, some exchanging glances that conveyed silent understanding. She could see the spark of recognition in their eyes, the quiet determination that had brought each of them to this place. They were here to reclaim something, to take control of their own lives, their own power. Over the weeks that followed, the classes became a safe haven, a space where they could learn and grow together. Tasha taught them how to stay grounded, to respond to aggression with calm, to use their voices and body language to convey confidence. She taught them practical self-defense techniques, movements that could protect them if ever they found themselves in dangerous situations. But she also taught them something deeper, the mindset of resilience, the ability to face fear without flinching, the strength to say no and mean it. Her students transformed before her eyes. She watched as once nervous participants found their footing, as they moved with more confidence, as they learned to meet each other's gaze without hesitation. She saw how they began to carry themselves differently, how they shed their uncertainty and replaced it with an inner strength that radiated from within. One evening, as the class ended, an older woman named Mrs. Jameson approached Tasha. Her hands were wrinkled and worn, her movements slower than the younger participants, but her eyes were bright with determination. "Thank you, Tasha," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You've given us something I didn't think I'd ever feel again, confidence. I didn't think it was possible at my age. But you made me believe in myself again." Tasha felt a surge of warmth as she took Mrs. Jameson's hands in hers, squeezing them gently. "You've always had it within you," she replied, her voice soft. "All I did was help you find it." In that moment, Tasha felt a deep sense of fulfillment, purpose she hadn't fully realized until now. She was making a difference, not just in her own life but in the lives of others. The events of that night in the warehouse had planted the seeds for something bigger, something that would leave a lasting impact on the people around her. Word of her classes spread, and soon people from all over the neighborhood were coming to join. Tasha's program grew, and she found herself working long hours, balancing her new role with her other responsibilities. But it didn't feel like a burden, felt like a calling, a mission that had taken root in her heart, one that gave her life new meaning. And as the weeks turned into months, Tasha saw the ripple effect of her work. Her students became more confident, more self-assured, more aware of their own worth. They carried their newfound strength into their daily lives, into their relationships, their work, their communities. They became beacons of resilience, people who would stand firm in the face of adversity, who would face life's challenges with an unbreakable spirit. Tasha knew that she had come full circle. She had faced down her own fear, her own doubts, and emerged stronger. Now, she was helping others do the same. And though she knew there would be more challenges, more encounters like the one with Officer Stevens, she felt ready. She was not alone. She was part of something larger, something that would continue long after she was gone. In the quiet of her own home, Tasha would sometimes reflect on that night, on the encounter that had sparked this journey. She would remember Stephen's face, his anger, his desperation, and feel a sense of peace. She had taken that moment of tension, that moment of fear, and turned it into something beautiful, something powerful. And in doing so, she had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of those around her. Her story was no longer just her own. It was a story of resilience, of courage, of finding strength in the most unexpected places. And as she moved forward, she knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would meet them with an unwavering spirit and an open heart, ready to make a difference,